The early spring is truly one of the best times of the year to catch some of the biggest bass that live in our lakes, rivers, and ponds. A lot of the female bass during this time of the year are completely full of eggs. So they will weigh the heaviest they will weigh pretty much all year long, and they are feeding up a lot of times in preparation for the spawn. And so in this video, I'm gonna give you the top 5 lures for early spring fishing. These are baits that not only catch big ones, but they also catch a lot of fish, and they work in a lot of different bodies of water. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. Now, real quick, if you guys would like to help support this channel, help me bring more videos like this to you, then consider shopping at Finn Fishing. Finn Fishing is an apparel brand that I started back in 21, and I'm really proud to say that I have one of the only USA made sun shirts out there on the market. I also have hats, I have shorts, I have a number of different products, and more are coming. So I'm gonna leave some links down below in the description. Again, shopping at Finn Fishing is truly the best way to help support this channel, and I greatly appreciate it. Now, before we get into those top 5 baits, it's really important to understand what the bass are doing in the early spring. If you kind of know where the bass are going, you can always stay ahead of them, which is really important to be able to catch a lot of fish. Now, the most important thing that you should realize this time of the year is that the bass are wanting to move up shallow. They are wanting to start pushing up shallow because they are wanting to spawn. And for the most part, bass need to spawn in shallow water, especially protected shallow water, because that is where their eggs have the best chance of survival. Now, the clearer that your body of water is, the deeper the bass can actually spawn. But for the most part, a lot of fish are going to be spawning in about 6 foot and less. And so during this time of the year, I always try to look for where the fish are going to be moving. I also like to look at where the fish just were. You know, a lot of times in the early spring, you have bass that are kind of been in these winter areas that are starting to push up shallow. So if you know where they were and you know where they're going, you can kind of stay in front of the bass throughout the spring. And you can also collide on some of these really good staging areas. Now, I'm gonna talk a little bit more specifically in probably a week about exactly where to find early spring bass. So I'm not gonna go into detail about it right now, but I do want you guys to kind of know what the bass are doing. Now, let's go ahead and get into the top 5 lures. Now, when it comes to springtime fishing, there is a wide array of lures that are going to work. You know, and depending on what kinds of bodies of water that you are fishing, they're going to be a little bit different here and there. Now, the top 5 that I have selected them because 1, they work in pretty much every type of body of water out there, and 2, not only do these ones catch a lot of fish, but they also catch those top of the top fish, the biggest fish in the bodies of water that you fish. So let's go ahead and get started with probably one of my favorites on this whole list, which is a 6 to 8 inch soft plastic swim bait. Now, for me, I really like the harnessed swim baits. The biggest reason that I like a harnessed swim baits over one that you might stick a really big EWG hook in is that here in Ohio, I fish for a lot of, like, you know, 1.5 to 3 pound fish, you know, maybe a little bit smaller on average. And if you fish a lot of ponds across America, you may run into the same thing, a lot of smaller fish. Now, although sometimes those small fish can get a big swim bait in their mouth and you can get an EWG hook into them, I have found that my better hookup rate is with the harness baits, the baits that actually come with a treble hook attached to them. Now, I like both the 6 inch version and the 8 inch version, and there's a ton of brands out there that make this pretty much exact same style bait. The one that I have probably the most confidence in, the one that's very popular, is a Megabass Mag Draft swim bait. This particular bait was one of the originals when it comes to the 6 inch bait. It wasn't really the original, but this one has caught a lot of fish. But the biggest difference with this bait and some of the other baits out there on the market is that there's really a smaller range at which this bait really works well. You know, if you kind of reel this bait too fast, it's gonna kind of kick out on you. If you reel it too slow, it also won't wag the tail. Now, every swim bait that I have tested out there is a little bit different in kind of the range that they work. And I actually did a full video on that I will link at the very end of this video. So if you guys want to kind of see what the best swim bait out there on the market is, you can just stay tuned till the end and you'll be able to check out that video. Now, when it comes to these 6 and 8 inch swim baits, I like to throw these things everywhere. And a lot of times it's going to be around cover, you know, whether that's a dock, a seawall, maybe a grass clump, whatever it may be. I like to just slow roll it, kind of at a slow to medium pace around cover. And a lot of fish that are starting to move up shallow, they want to get one big meal before they start to move up and go on their beds. And so these swim baits, I'm telling you, they get humongous bites, but they also catch a lot of fish. I mean, if you look at the 6 inch version of this bait, it's really not that much bigger than a chatterbait or a swim jig. Like it may be an inch or so bigger, but it's not that much bigger. And so the nice thing is that you still get a lot of the same bites that you get from chatterbaits and other baits, but it seems like you will catch a bigger on average fish with this bait than you will with a lot of other baits. Now, the two that like I said, I like anything from a 6 to 8 inch version. And if you look, for example, at the 6 inch version right here and an 8 inch version, the 6 inch, it's only 2 inches shorter, but you can see here, it's probably half as much plastic than the 8 inch version. And this one is, I mean, this one's probably twice as heavy. And because of that, I really like to throw these on different rod and reel configurations. The smaller one, the one that I fish the most, the 6 inch version, I like to throw it on 15 or 16 pound fluorocarbon line, straight fluorocarbon. That might sound a little bit smaller on average than some guys would throw on a swim bait. But the thing about that little bit lighter line is it really allows that bait to get a little bit more head wiggle to it. And it just looks, I mean, if you look at every fish, every bait fish out there, as they're swimming through the water, they all have that head wiggle. And so it makes those baits look a little bit more natural. And I think with that 15 and 16 pound line, you just get more bites with it. I've also never broken off on 15 or 16 pound. When it comes to the rod, I like my standard jig rod. This is a 7-foot, 3-inch heavy power rod with a fast action. That to me is really the perfect rod. And this is actually an Arc Essence rod. And real quick, if you guys are interested in any Arc products, you can actually use my coupon code BFHQ over on their website, and you can get 10% off any Arc rods or reels. And then when it comes to the reel, speaking of them, I actually like something kind of either in the 6 or low 7 range. This reel right here is a 7.1 to 1 gear ratio. This is about as fast as I will go with this style of swim bait, because the thing is like I said, these baits have kind of a range at where they work really well. And sometimes if you kind of reel this too fast, it starts to keel over on its side. So using something in the low 7s or in the 6 kind of helps me to keep that bait going slowly, which helps me to work it properly. Now, when it comes to the bigger bait, the 8-inch bait, I like to throw this on 20-pound fluorocarbon. Again, it's a little bit heavier bait, and I'm also going to use it on a little bit bigger rod. I like a 7-foot, 6-inch heavy power rod, fast action rod. But again, the reel is actually the same. I like it on kind of that 7.1 to 1 gear ratio reel, and that's really been a great rod for this swim bait that I've used a lot in the past. Now, no matter what, probably the most important thing when it comes to fishing these soft swim baits is adding some sort of harnessed hook on there. A harnessed trailer hook, a little stinger hook is what we call it. And the reason being is that you will have fish that hit this in weird ways. I've also seen it where certain days you will catch every single fish on one of these stinger hooks. And so this is a little owner stinger hook. There's a number of companies that make these. You can even make one yourself if you want, but I like to attach it to the kind of the eye of the swim bait and just run it across the back. This is something that Byron Velvick, who's a big swim bait fisherman out west, used to do. I picked up from him how to do this. And from then on, I started doing it. There's a lot of fish that have been caught on that stinger that I would not have caught with the main hook. And that to me is the most important thing when it comes to the swim baits. Now let's move on to the very next bait. This is also one of my favorites. And to me, it is one that I use a little bit more earlier in the spring than the rest. And that is a jerkbait. A jerkbait, as most of us know, is a great cold water bait. It's also a great bait to use no matter what time of the year it is. But during the pre-spawn in that early spring time frame, I always have a couple of these rigged up and ready to go. And the reason that I say a couple is that sometimes I want to get a jerkbait a little bit deeper. This particular bait that I have right here is a Berkeley Stunner. It's the +1 version. It runs about 6 to 7 foot deep on average. Over here, I have the +2. The +2 will run about 10 to 12 foot. And the nice thing about jerkbaits, probably the thing that I like about them the most, is that they have tremendous drawing power. Whether you use forward-facing sonar or not, you kind of realize how far away a bass can see this thing, feel this thing, and how far they are willing to come and get to it. I was actually using a +1 just the other day, and I was catching fish that were in 15 and 16 foot of water, but they were coming up in the water column 8, 9, 10 foot to get this bait. So that's something that is really nice about a jerkbait, is that you can fish a pretty large water column with this bait and still catch a lot of fish. I mean, you could throw the +2 in 20 foot of water, and those fish would easily come up 8 foot off the bottom to get the bait. Now, one of the most important things when it comes to a jerkbait, not necessarily the most, but I do like to have a little bit better water clarity. I like to be able to see in the water 2.5, 3 foot kind of minimum. If you get into really muddy water, it can still be an effective bait, but personally, I believe that there are some better baits, and we're going to talk about some of those here in just a moment. So when it comes to the jerkbait, I really like kind of a little bit more water clarity. Now, when it comes to the rod and reel in line with this bait, it's really important to have a designated jerkbait setup. I tried for a long time to use a jerkbait on crankbait rods. And for me, I really like composite crankbait rods, and composite rods tend to weigh just a tad bit more than a pure graphite rod. But over the years, I've kind of switched over to more of a pure graphite rod, and it has worked out really well. I feel like I lose barely any fish with a jerkbait these days. And that really comes down to the rod. Now, when it comes to the rod that I like, this is an ARC Tharp Series one-eyed jack rod. It was literally made for a jerkbait. And so it's a 6'9" rod. I tend to like to have a little bit shorter rods with a jerkbait because you're constantly working this bait. And so when you're constantly kind of working this bait, a shorter rod is just going to be more comfortable in your hand all day. And you're not going to be smacking the top of the water, smacking the side of the boat, which is what you might be doing if you are using a longer rod. The rod, what you really want in a jerkbait rod is a little bit more of a parabolic bending rod. And I say that anytime I'm fishing a hard bait with treble hooks, you want a parabolic bending rod. That is truly going to help you to catch more fish that eat the bait. Because if you're using too stiff of a rod, you're going to lose a ton of them on a jerkbait. And this one-eyed jack rod, it's perfect for the jerkbait. Now, when it comes to the line, I really like 10-pound fluorocarbon. Sometimes I'll use 12-pound fluorocarbon, but I kind of live in that zone, 10 or 12-pound line. And if you go too heavy with a jerkbait, as far as your pound test, it kind of starts to restrict the action of that bait. Now, when it comes to the reel, for the most part, you shouldn't be using the reel a lot when you're actually working a jerkbait besides just catching up your slack. So I really like something in the 7 range. This is, again, a 7.1-to-1 gear ratio reel. It's a really good reel. And a jerkbait is just a great bait. You can fish it, again, in clear water, but you can fish it around docks, around rocks, around grass, and it catches a ton of fish. Now let's go ahead and move on to the next bait. This is one that I actually like a little bit more in muddy water, and that is the good old classic spinnerbait. A spinnerbait by far has been one of the best producing baits of all time. Now, over the last several years, I kind of felt like the chatterbait took the place of a spinnerbait. And a lot of people would use a chatterbait instead of a spinnerbait. Now, the thing with that is that because so many people have used a chatterbait, and I'm not saying a chatterbait isn't a good bait by any means. As a matter of fact, it's one of the best baits out there. But because so many people have used a chatterbait, I feel at times that bass are really used to the vibration that a chatterbait puts off. So instead, using a spinnerbait again, I feel like I've started to get some of those bigger than average bites on a spinnerbait. And if you use a little bit more of a finesse spinnerbait, you will catch a ton of fish on this bait. But to me, I like about a ½ ounce. This is a ½ ounce spinnerbait right here. And I typically in the pre-spawn am going to use one that has a bigger blade on that. And that could be a bigger Colorado blade or even a bigger willow blade. It seems like those big bladed spinnerbaits will catch some of the biggest bass during the pre-spawn. And so I really like to use this bait, like I said though, in muddy water. You know, when you get to lakes that have very low visibility, I mean 6 inches, a foot of visibility, even less than that, a spinnerbait is probably the #1 bait that I'm going to pick up. It's definitely the bait that I'm going to pick up as far as a search lure goes, to be able to cover a lot of water. Now, when you are fishing in muddy water, the thing is that bass like to get very tight to cover. And I've used this analogy before, but if I'm in this garage like I am right now, if I were to click the lights off and it was completely pitch black in here, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna feel around with my hand and get close to something, you know, maybe a wall where I know I can kind of use that wall to get to where I need to go. The same thing kind of happens when you have bass that are in muddy water. They like to get tight to cover. That way they can feel a little bit more comfortable as far as where they are going. And so the thing with this spinnerbait, you want to put this thing in the cover, put it right into a lay down, put it right up against the stump, put it up underneath of a dock. The nice thing about spinnerbaits is you can actually skip them. If you put a bigger piece of plastic on there, you are really able to skip a spinnerbait further than you would think, and you can get it way up underneath of a dock. But to me, if I'm fishing shallow water and muddy water, anywhere from about 48 degrees all the way until about 65 when those bass are spawning, a spinnerbait is my go-to. It just catches a lot of big fish. Now, me personally, I like to put a soft plastic on a spinnerbait more than actually use a treble hook. And as you see right here, I actually have a Zoom Fat Albert on the back of this particular spinnerbait. The reason that I like to put a piece of soft plastic on there is it just provides a little bit of volume. It provides a little bit of bulk to that bait. And when a bass kind of comes up behind that bait and opens up its mouth, it creates a negative pressure and it's going to draw that bait into that fish's mouth. Now, if there's no plastic on there, there's not enough there for the bass to be able to draw that bait in as well. You put a piece of plastic on there, again, it adds volume, it allows that bass to suck that bait in and get that bait a little bit deeper. So I've actually stopped using treble hooks and trailer hooks with my spinnerbaits. And the nice thing about that is because I don't use trailer hooks, I feel like I can get it into thick cover where other guys aren't putting their spinnerbaits, and therefore I'm getting a couple extra bites. But you gotta have that soft plastic on there to really help them to suck that bait in. Now let's go ahead and jump in to the next bait. This is bait number 4, and that is a crankbait of some sort, kind of a shallow to medium depth diving crankbait. You gotta have them this time of the year. To me, the early spring is probably one of the best times of the year to throw a crankbait, period. And it catches a ton of fish and it catches big ones. Now, I like several different crankbaits during this time of the year. You really kind of just have to match the conditions and the situation that you are fishing. You know, for me, a couple of my absolute favorites, the Rapala series, the Rapala DT series. It's a balsa bait. It doesn't have many rattles in it at all. They do kind of drill it out and put a small BB in there, but it's a very silent bait. And so therefore in cold water, this becomes a very effective bait because it's subtle and it's silent. They also have the DT series that runs in a ton of different depths. I mean, you have a DT4 that'll go 4 foot, you got a DT20 that'll go 20 foot, and you have a bunch of them in between. The one that I pick up the most is probably this one. This is a DT8. I used to fish a DT6 a lot, but since they came out with the 8, it's just the one that I typically pick up the most during the pre-spawn. Now, it's not the only crankbait I will use. I also absolutely love a Berkley Fritz side crankbait. This is a flat-sided crankbait, and kind of like the Rapala DT series, it is a tighter wiggling bait, and therefore it works a little bit better in colder water. Now the Fritz side, I use the shallower version of it. So if I'm fishing in like less than 4 foot of water, typically that's when I pick up that Berkley Fritz side. And I'm gonna use it in a lot of the exact same situations, on rock banks, around wood cover. And the good thing about crankbaits is the water clarity doesn't always matter. You can catch fish on crankbaits with crankbaits in really clear water. You can also catch them in really muddy water. And so a crankbait is just a really good tool for us anglers to use to be able to cover a ton of water and really hone in exactly where the bass are. Now, one thing that I absolutely love is throwing a red crankbait this time of the year. In the pre-spawn, a lot of times you're going to have crawfish that are emerging out of their little burrows. And if you have crawfish, especially the red swamp crawlers that have been burrowing in those red clay throughout the winter, a lot of times that crawfish is gonna eat some zooplankton that's in that clay. It's going to actually eat some clay in the process, and that red clay's pigment is going to translate into that crawfish itself. So therefore, a lot of crawfish that are coming out during this time of the year, they're pretty red in color. And so therefore, a red colored bait or anything red can be really good in all of our baits, all the baits that I've mentioned so far. Sometimes having a little bit of red on there can really help you. But when it comes to cranking, it's almost always, I'm gonna have something red. Let's go ahead and get into the last bait. If you guys noticed, the baits that I chose so far, they are all pretty fast moving baits. And the thing about it is that during the pre-spawn and in early spring, I am primarily fishing a lot of fast moving baits because they tend to work better and you tend to catch a lot of fish. Now, there's always going to be a time and place to slow down. And when it comes to slowing down, I go with a jig all the time. A good jig, usually a 3/8 ounce jig or a 1/2 ounce jig is what I'm going to use. And I'm going to put this thing anywhere and everywhere. The nice thing about a jig, it works in muddy water. It works in clear water. You can fish it very deep. You know, you can use a 1/2 ounce, 3/4 ounce jig, fish it on some offshore structure. You can also take a 1/4 ounce jig or 3/8 ounce jig and flip it into a log in muddy water. But when I want to slow down, maybe I found an area where it seems like there's a lot of fish and I caught them on a spinnerbait and I want to slow down now and kind of pick this area apart. That's when I'm going to pick up the jig. And it's just a great bait. I prefer it over a Texas rig until the spawn. When the fish move up and they're on beds, that's when I tend to switch over to a Texas rig. But a jig is just such a good bait. Now, earlier in this video, I talked about swim baits. I talked about that mag draft swim bait. And anyways, I did a full video reviewing the best 6-inch swim baits out there on the market, and I'm gonna leave it linked right up here. So if you guys wanna watch another video all about swim bait fishing, you can check this one out next. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one.